I'm gonna date myself a bit here, but I spent a lot of my time growing up reading gaming magazines, scrolling through forums, and watching a bunch of early internet gaming personalities, all while soaking in random opinions. And sadly, it wasn't until way later in life that I realized that a lot of the video game criticism that I had consumed and internalized as gospel was completely off base or even ignorant of the topic that was being reviewed, leading me to discover that some games that I thought were terrible because some dude yelled about it in a video once were actually pretty good. So with that in mind, I want to look at an entry from the premier fighting game franchise that has always had a bit of a negative stigma attached to it, and discuss why I think it's garnered that reputation while also dissuading as much of that image away. And no, this video isn't about Street Fighter the movie, the game, because even that game has had a bit of a resurgence of appreciation within the fighting game community for being a fun and goofy game in recent times. Today, we're tackling Street Fighter EX3, which is one of the least played and hardly talked about entries in the entire Street Fighter franchise. And that's not really surprising, considering its lackluster reviews from the time and the fact that it would show up in videos like Screw Attack's top 10 worst fighting games, which was a bit of a death sentence to a game's reputation when these types of creators were the tastemakers of online gaming culture. But don't worry, I think there are more factors that play into EX3's lack of presence in the fighting game community than just old game reviews. So, let's hurry up and dive in. I'm gonna start this off with a very brief history lesson. It all starts with Arika, which is a video game company formed in 1995 made up of ex-Capcom employees, including Akira Nishitani, who was the lead designer behind Street Fighter 2. Which is kinda funny, cause after they all left Capcom to form their own company, the newly formed Arika team would immediately start working on Street Fighter again, with Capcom, as their first ever game as a new studio. Hitting the arcades in 1996, Arika's Street Fighter EX brought the series into 3D, while still keeping the gameplay on a 2D plane. The game was a bit simple and very familiar, being sort of a blend of Street Fighter 2 and Alpha. So if you've played any Street Fighter before, you can jump into EX with no issues. The game was met with a generally positive reception on its release in both the arcades and later on with its updated home port on the PS1. Which, I mean, yeah, it shouldn't be a surprise that the team who's already worked on Street Fighter could make another solid Street Fighter. And in 90s fighting game tradition, Arika immediately popped another one out soon after with Street Fighter EX2, which of course got an update with Street Fighter EX2 Plus, and this game just rules so hard. Arika really fleshed out the ideas laid out in the first EX, and turned them into something rich, deep, and just fun. In a nutshell, the EX games are very footsie and neutral based, but the strong system mechanics like being able to cancel supers into other supers, guard crushes, and the custom combo activation excel let you cash out for damage extremely hard. Plus the Arika original characters like Skullomania are super unique, but even the OG Street Fighter characters are a bit different, cause some of them have new moves that have only ever shown up in this series. Also, these games just have a very strong charisma and flavor to them. Everyone knows how godly the soundtracks to these games are, but there's a lot to the aesthetic, atmosphere, and characters that just isn't found in the Capcom Street Fighter games. EX2 Plus is actually my favorite Street Fighter game, and it still has a dedicated competitive scene in Japan and in the West. And don't worry, a more detailed video on my love for EX2 will come eventually. And in between the releases of EX2 and EX2 Plus, Arika also put out the cult classic Fighting Layer, which is an original fighter that pushes the ideas from the EX series and actually expands into the Z-axis. And guess what? This game is super sick too. Sadly, it's stuck in Japanese arcades though, cause it's never been ported to anything. But that won't stop me from port begging on Twitter. So the point of this mini history lesson was to show that Street Fighter's transition to 3D has actually aged pretty gracefully. I feel like there's an idea among casual audiences that the EX series in general was a misstep for the Street Fighter franchise. But these first two games are still beloved among the fighting game community, and were reviewed pretty positively. So Arika was 3 for 3 on their fighting game releases so far, but in the year 2000, they released Street Fighter EX3, and apparently everyone hated it. Did Arika just forget how to make a fighter and fumble? What the hell happened? At first glance, EX3 is more of the same. There was no big overhaul from EX2 here, cause buttons, specials, combos, and everything else still feels just like the previous entries. with only the system mechanics really being switched up. Super canceling your super into other supers is still intact from the first two EX games, but the guard break and custom combo excel mechanic from EX2 are now gone, and they were replaced by a new universal overhead and the momentary cancel system, which is a really crazy and interesting mechanic that lets you literally cancel special moves into other special moves for absolutely free. You can Hadouken into a Tatsu, or even Sonic Boom into a Flash Kick, and all it costs is you having the super tight execution needed to do it. Seriously, this mechanic is just ridiculous in a fun way. And some characters even have special moves that only exist within momentary combo cancels. It's better for some characters than others, but when it's good, it rules. The other more obvious and main change to EX3 is that it's a tag game. Yeah, for real, a 2v2 Street Fighter. And would you be surprised to learn its tag system is pretty freeform, with an active tag similar to something like Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite? You pick two characters, and by pressing both heavy buttons at the same time, you can tag between your characters. But you can also cancel into a tag to continue your combo or pressure. The best part is after you cancel into a tag, you can still act as the character that's switching for a moment, which lets you do a bunch of fun stuff. You can continue a combo or block string, or zone and switch, or even go into supers off a switch. It's incredibly strong, because literally any normal can cancel into a tag. So you got characters like Dalsum sniping you into a tag confirm from the other side of the screen. Also, the startup for activating a tag stops the game for a second, making it easier to react to your opponent, or do nasty setups. Like tag canceling into a tick grab, that you can of course combo off of. And the juggle system is super loose in the EX series, so as long as you have some super meter, you can do some very goofy combos. And each character has their own set of super meter, so there's potentially a lot of gas to cook with. Or you could just throw an entire can of gasoline on the grill and do a critical parade, which calls out both characters for you to control at once, and gives you an infinite amount of meter for a short period of time. Some characters can really abuse this. And of course, there are team supers for specific team combinations too, with a lot of them genuinely being very cool and creative. Shoutouts to Dalsum literally setting Blanc on fire in theirs. I really think the tag mechanic rules, and I'm honestly surprised how loose Arika lets the player be with it. It's incredibly strong and easy to confirm off of, so it's an option you're always gravitated towards, which I think is good in a game with an active tag like this. I'd much rather it end up being busted than boring. And I'm also glad to say that Arika wasn't afraid to have some dumb fun with the team aspect, because there's a fun 4-player mode where each player can control a character in a standard 2v2 match, or even in a dramatic battle mode where everyone is out at the same time, in 2v2 or 3v1 matches. It's goofy and I love it. And speaking of modes, even the arcade mode is kinda cool, because it puts you in a variety of match styles, and lets you pick certain objectives in each match to fulfill. And you can even recruit characters you've beaten to join your team. It's a lot more involved than just fighting 8 characters than Bison at the end. The last cool brand new addition to EX3 is the character Ace, who is a blank slate that has an entire moveset that you can customize. You can give him a Hadouken, a Flash Kick, an SPD, or even moves from an entirely different game. This is the casual fighting game fun that every fighter should have. And I'm glad that Street Fighter is finally doing this exact same thing again, over 20 years later. To me, EX3 is not only a solid Street Fighter EX game, but it's also Street Fighter at its most gonzo, and I really love it for that. It still has a lot of the Arika charm and aesthetic, and you've all seen a Maximilian video before, so y'all know Arika's in-house band Super Sweep killed the soundtrack too. So, EX3 sounds pretty cool. Why all the hate then? Well, I think I have some solid explanations. And let's start with the fact that it was a PS2 launch title, which definitely should be a good thing, but I think trying to get the game out early hurt its arrival. I won't lie, EX3 definitely isn't the prettiest game in the world. In fact, it can be a bit ugly and all over the place. Characters look off and almost uncanny because there's a strange attempt at realism for some characters, while others straight up look like bad action figures. This gets worse when juxtaposed against the amazing official art for EX3, which has some of my favorite renditions of the Street Fighter cast. We already had Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast at this point, so these definitely weren't the next-gen graphics everyone was looking for, which I think also contributed to the feeling that Street Fighter doesn't belong in 3D for many at the time. While the game still has that Arika aesthetic, things look a bit bland and washed out. There are also some very strange parallax scrolling decisions made. Like this forest stage is pretty headache-inducing. The roster is also pretty disappointing, cause it's literally the same exact roster from EX2 Plus, besides Ace, who doesn't really count. This is a bit baffling to me honestly, but I try to rationalize this by understanding that the PS2 was literally brand new hardware to the industry, and Arika is a small company who tried playing it safe on launch. But none of that matters when you remember that Tekken Tag Tournament was also a North American PS2 launch title, and that blew EX3 out of the water in almost every aspect. I think another attributing factor to EX3's harsh reception was the general fatigue of 2D fighters at this point. The market was absolutely flooded with them, which wasn't helped by Capcom, because they had 3 different Street Fighter series releasing alongside each other, and that's not even factoring in all of their other fighters and crossover games. So while I think it's not fair to compare the gameplay between EX3 and Tekken Tag Tournament, it's also not hard to see why Tekken Tag completely overshadowed EX3 when it truly represented an evolution for the Tekken franchise, the fighting game genre, and console hardware. EX3 being a launch title also meant that gamers were most definitely playing the game on pads and not on stick, which alienated arcade players. And that also leads us to what I think is the most important nail in EX3's coffin. Street Fighter EX3 was not only a PS2 launch title, it was a PS2 exclusive. Unlike every other Street Fighter up to this point, there was no arcade release for EX3. We all know that Japan has a very strong game center culture, and a lot of fighting games have persevered through time and kept dedicated scenes in the present day because of the passion that players in arcades have to keep their favorite fighters alive, whether the games themselves are niche or not. This leaves EX3 without a lot of legacy, because most fighting game tournaments at this point were played in the arcade, even in America. So when EX3 came out, no top players were spending their time grinding the game, and there were no rivalries or exhibitions, and just not a lot of discussion happened for EX3 in general, even though discussion exists today for the other Arika fighters, because this game was stuck on console. Don't get me wrong though, EX3 has its fans and dedicated players who have helped spread the gospel since its release, but it's much more far and few between than every other Street Fighter. I think this only reinforces the negative stigma the game has, cause a lot of the discussions for EX3 revolve around asking why it supposedly sucks, or if anyone even remembers it in the first place. Because of this, EX3 also feels like the least explored game in the Street Fighter franchise as well. There's probably a treasure trove of cheap and evil stuff in here that's waiting to be uncovered. So yeah, EX3 kinda just came out and went without a scene really having a chance to develop for it. And all that was left for anyone to discuss were those initial feelings on launch. But the worst Street Fighter game ever? Come on, not even close. EX3 is an extremely solid and ridiculous game. There's a lot here to dig into, while also having some dumb, fun, casual stuff on the side, which is sadly more than a lot of the fighting games even today. It's not a masterpiece by any means, and it's not even my favorite in the EX series, but it's really cool and doesn't deserve most of the hate. And look, I'm gonna say it. Arika doesn't make bad fighting games. Everything they've put out is a banger, okay? I just want to get on my soapbox and say that a lot of game criticism can be a bit unfair and outdated, cause a lot of quote-unquote bad games can and should be viewed in a different context than just what they were at launch. One of the best things about gaming nowadays is that we can go back and re-examine titles in a new light, cause they're easily accessible and we're not paying $60 for them. So a lot of games can foster communities and discussion that they couldn't afford before. I think Street Fighter EX3 is really cool and misunderstood, and that you and some friends should try playing it before writing it off, and maybe you'll discover how cool it is, just like how Max did. Thanks!